We're going to move right into our next panel called Framing Leadership Strategies for the Future, and I'd like to invite our moderator, Doug Bauer. He is Executive Director at the Clark Foundation. He's also Executive Director of the Screven and Fernley Foundations and Senior VP of the Clark Estates. And I'd like to invite him and Jessica Cavanero, Hilda Polanco, and Michelle Yanchi to the podium and the panel table.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Good morning, everybody. How you doing? Not good enough. Good morning, everyone. All right. So I want you to know I was jotting down my remarks, and Sister Paulette Lamonaco said, just wing it. And I thought, well, she usually gets her orders from a higher being, so maybe I could wing it and be all right. But no, I did write down some remarks to introduce our panel. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you to Claire and Luana and the BBB team for always putting on this symposium. It's obviously one of the premier annual events in the sector here in the city, and it's always a pleasure to be a part of it. David mentioned storms in his opening remarks, and I want to pick up on that metaphor. I grew up in the Midwest, Michigan to be specific, and to just date myself, I had a paper route. They no longer exist. And to really date myself, I had a paper route for an afternoon newspaper, which never exists anymore, the Detroit News. And I remember when I'd be out on my paper route, first of all, storms in the Midwest move west to east. You always knew where they were coming from, so you would see them on the horizon. And so there I'd be out on my paper route, and if I saw on the horizon it was just gray, I knew I was going to get wet. If it was dark gray, I was probably going to get drenched. If it was gray-black, I had to get home. And if it was black, green, purple, you had to get home really fast and get into the basement. The other indicator of about storms in the Midwest was if it was in that black, green, purple, things got very quiet. Birds in particular knew when something was going to happen. So I share that imagery because, in my estimation, there is a storm coming for the city's nonprofit sector. This storm has been triggered by political forces, and it was produced by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, while this legislation may be a boon for business and the ultra-wealthy, there is deep concern that this act's negative impact will be quite severe on the nonprofit sector. Within the act itself is the restructuring of the charitable deduction, which the Urban Institute and the Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy notes could reduce charitable giving in this country by $13 to $20 billion. And in testimony yesterday, at City Council, the Deputy Controller for the Budget, Preston Niblack, am I pronouncing that correct? Niblack, had the following to say. He said the loss of the SALT deductibility, that of course is the state and local taxes, the loss of the SALT deductibility also means that many more taxpayers will likely choose the expanded standard deduction rather than itemizing, which also has implications for charitable giving. For example, many middle-income households may be affected by this, and while they are no doubt most often motivated by other concerns than just reducing their income tax liability, it nonetheless eliminates an incentive for charitable giving that could potentially impact the fundraising for many nonprofit social service agencies and other organizations, which are, of course, a critical part of the city's social services network. So the real concern of the Tax Cut Jobs Act is how we're going to pay for it. Or more specifically, how do the Republicans want to pay for it and really cover its cost? In short, federal government spending on domestic programs will probably be severely impacted. In New York City, that could mean some real trouble. In case you didn't know, 2/3 of the NYCHA budget comes from federal money. 41% of the ACS budget comes from federal money. 8% of DYCD's budget comes from federal money. And let's not forget that the New York State budget for FY19, not next year, but the budget coming up, is staring at a $4 to $5 billion deficit. So then, what kind of storm are we staring at on the horizon? What do we do? How do we, as leaders in the nonprofit sector, and I looked at the registration list, mostly all of you are senior managers and CEOs, how do we prepare? What are the strategies and tactics we need to think about and utilize? So that's really what the discussion of this panel is this morning. I'm delighted to say that we have three experts on the podium who not only observe but actively participate in the work that all of you do. I'm not going to read their bios. They're in the packet that you received. But this is Michelle Yancey, the Associate Director of Government and External Relations for Good Shepherd Services. Next to her is Hilda Polanco, who's the founder and CEO of Fiscal Management Associates. She is also chair of the Better Business Bureau Foundation of Metro New York. Thank you for doing that, Hilda. And finally, Jessica Cavanero from Sea Change Capital Partners, a nonprofit merchant bank. She's a partner at Sea Change. So we have three people that are very good at what they do. They've been actively involved with all of you in different aspects of your work. I'm going to do this. I'm going to ask them a couple of questions. We want you to ask them some questions. So there's index cards similar to what we did with Jim. Hopefully you'll do with us as well. They'll be brought up and we'll shuffle through those as well. But let me start by asking everyone here on a panel the question, which is, from your perspective, what is different about this current operating environment, and why should nonprofit leaders be thinking differently? And Michelle, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. Happy to be here. I've worked with Hilda and Jess before, and I have to tell you that you are in very good hands today, even despite whatever I might have to share with you. So first, let me start actually by what's the same. What's the same is that our nonprofit work is very largely governed and affected by swings in the economy and the political waters. That is still the reality of the work that we do. However, what's different is that the arc of that swing of politics is wider than ever before. I would say that for the first 25 years of my work as a government affairs professional, I've seen the economy go up, I've seen it go down. I've worked under Republican administrations, under Democratic administrations, with conservatives and liberals. However, at the city, state, and federal level. However, I sort of think of it a lot like bowling with my kids. You know, the bumpers are up. And so while, you might go straight down the middle, or your swing might go to one side or the other, was a pretty solid understanding of the margin that you'll be dealing with in terms of what might happen. If there's anything that's really different right now, I would say that the bumpers are off. That the potential arc of the swing of what we might be experiencing is greater and more unpredictable than at least I could say I've ever experienced in a quarter century of doing this work. What's also potentially different is that organizations like ours no longer have the margin for error in our budgets, enough of a cushion to adjust that we used to have in the past. Government contracts used to be funded much closer to what the cost of actually doing business was. That gap has grown, and so that actually makes us less prepared to respond to even normal swings, let alone the unpredictable ones. And lastly, I think we can expect that our work will be needed even more greatly than ever before. So the needs that we'll be needing to respond to while our boat rocks dramatically on the sea is going to be higher than ever.
Okay. Hilda, what do you think?
So, thank you, Doug. I think as I heard you refer to the storms in the Midwest, I thought about how nimble you were in trying to decide what your choices were going to be. And I think for nonprofits, we have to think equally about the fact that what may have worked in the past and what history may have shown is probably not a direct indicator of what the future will hold. So with the guardrail analogy as well, our leadership teams need to be nimble. We often have the expression of building the planning muscle. Just when we think we have the answer, we realize that wasn't quite what we thought, and we need to think differently. So I encourage all of leadership and boards to be ready for what we call scenario planning, and whereas some scenarios may feel almost like paralysis, what if the swing was that deep? it's not thinking about it is worse than thinking of it. So the planning muscle, the nimbleness, and also thinking about one disruptor that I think not just in operations program development, and that's the impact of technology in the way that you do your work. We've always thought of technology as an engine for change, but I think now more than ever, we need our team members to be more analytical and more focused on the what ifs and the strategy and less on doing the daily transaction. So that's where we think automation and technology could make a difference.
Great. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
Really good to say good morning this morning. What are your thoughts?
So thanks for having me. Thank you, Michelle, Hilda, and Doug for queuing this up. I think, to use a Game of Thrones analogy, winter is here. But not to be all doom and gloom. From my seat, I have the great pleasure of working with many of the folks in this room every day to talk proactively about what is happening and what strategies they might be able to pursue. So from my seat, what I see is that people are much more aware of time. And in this environment, time can be both a luxury that can quickly turn lethal if you're not really thinking quite carefully about what your strengths are, having honest conversations about what your weaknesses are, and thinking about what you might be able to do both independently and together. And so I guess the broad answer to your question is people are much more aware of time. So maybe we're all doing our jobs by wearing our watches and thinking about the world writ large.
Okay, and we got one Winter of Thrones metaphor in already today. That's good. All right, so let me just drill down on this a little bit more, because you've offered up some interesting ideas, all three of you. So kind of by way of Ben Franklin, who said an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, then what is it that nonprofits could be doing proactively to build a more sustainable business model now, and obviously I think more important in the next couple of years? And Jessica, why don't we start with you and we'll go back that way.
Great. So I think something that strikes me is that if we're all being honest, board reporting across the sector is terrible. I mean, raise your hand if you're taking QuickBooks polls and presenting them year over year to your board. No? Okay. Maybe it's not as bad as I think. What I would say is every year, and get the most operational disciplined person on your team and put him or her in charge of it. Every year with your board, have a conversation about what you're good at and what you're bad at. Just every year. And look at your board reporting and ask a friend to say, do you understand how we're presenting our financial picture? Because I think boards are challenged. They're volunteers, they come into the room and they don't want to throw rocks into the water. But if an outside party doesn't understand your financials, and your board should, maybe it's a good time to think about how you can repackage that information in a way that is sensible, that can highlight some of the places of stress and some of the positives.
Okay. Hilda?
So one of the key elements that we at FMA think about is understanding your business model. So part of Doug's question is how can nonprofits more proactively have a sustainable one? So in order to have a sustainable business model, we need to understand what the drivers are. And Michelle, you mentioned changes in government, and we always get to pick on government. I'm sure we have government friends here in the audience. One of the challenges with government funding is that it often will not cover the full cost. There are other sources of restricted funding that may not cover the cost. So we often hesitate to indicate that a program is running a deficit or it's in the red, sort of very negative connotations. In order to have a sustainable business model, activities have to cover their cost. So understanding which ones do and which ones don't lead us to know one thing, and that is, where are we investing our unrestricted resources? So rather than thinking of a deficit program, think of where are the places that we're making choices to continue to do programming where the actual result is that it's taking from the unrestricted resources, which could be the cushions for the future or for strategic growth or for change. And so in making those choices, board need to have that information. Thinking of the business model and what is working and what isn't is part of that, and being able to share that with your board.
So to add on to what was said, I think that we have to actually go right at the heart of what it means to be a leader in the nonprofit sector. I think that our natural inclination as individuals, as humans, as rugged individualists of the United States of America, is that our job as a nonprofit leader is to grow our organization. And I actually think that the number one job of a nonprofit leader, certainly right now, but possibly at all times, is to prepare for contraction, not growth. And what that means is really being focused on what your mission is and thinking about your job as a steward of that mission and how that might be greater than being a steward of your actual organization. And so really thinking about, in times of contraction, would the next business step for your organization be to seek a collaboration, to seek a merger, to ask to be acquired by a larger organization that actually could put some fuel behind your strategic plan that you might not be able to do in the current environment, or whatever your particular situation is. Having worked for an organization that was on the other side of that, and receiving those requests from organizations, I have two pieces of advice from both sides of the equation. If you're a leader and you're looking at your sort of next 3 to 5 years, and you think that a merger with another organization might be the best next step, don't wait. Don't wait too long. You can reach out to the folks right here at this table to help you with that. The number one challenge that we have faced as an organization that's taken on other organizations is that they waited too long. And then the second side of the equation is from the organizations who is the receiver of we don't like to really think in terms of mergers and acquisitions, but actually that should be part of nonprofit management education. And that is making sure that your organization has a strong core. It's much easier to raise program funds, which I'm sure we'll touch on this later in the panel. But the only thing that really makes it possible to merge effectively with an organization, especially one that's waited too long, is to have a strong institutional core, especially financial management, program evaluation, and risk management.
Okay. Well, I know Michelle's going to stay with Good Shepherd Services, but I think she just joined Sea Change as a senior fellow, so that was great. So I want you guys. This is good. So just to get granular and specific, just real quick. So as we think about all of this, and you've offered some great advice already, what is one tool or tactic that you think every nonprofit must adopt in this environment? And Hilda, why don't we start with you?
So back to my planning analogy, I think every nonprofit should have this concept of scenario planning and consideration on an annual basis. The idea that a plan is set in stone and we're ready to go is something that just doesn't work any longer. So there's two words that I've become really connected with this year, and that one is course correction, and another one is recalibration. If your planning systems are so rigid that the idea that you might have to go back to the planning process is overwhelming, that probably means you need to build that muscle a bit more. And know that as soon as you end your planning process, you'll need to go back and make changes. But making those eagerly and proactively will help you stay ahead of the curve. So have any of us spent any time doing a budget to actual variance analysis ever in your career? Right, we've spent some time doing that, and that is time spent justifying why life didn't turn out the way we hoped. And it doesn't. And so I want you to shift your focus from budget to actual analysis. Why didn't it turn out the way we thought? And shift it to forecasting. Given what we know, given what we've learned, how are we in a position to predict or project what will happen? So I think one very important discipline is this idea of shifting from the past to shifting to the future.
Hey, Hilda, I'm just curious. I'm going to go a little off script, but you said something that I think is interesting, and I know you not only do this work in New York, but nationally. You were just in Arizona. Are you saying that is strategic planning becoming kind of a fossil or a dinosaur? I mean, and it's interesting. The Clark Foundation just completed its cycle of site visits for its March board meeting, visited 22 nonprofits. And several of them were like, we just finished our 5-year strategic plan, and they're good plans. I'm not knocking any of them that I read, but is it kind of superfluous to be doing strategic planning now?
So the word strategic planning is off-putting, I think, to folks. If the future is so unpredictable, how could we pretend that we can predict the next 5 years? And I have seen a shift from 5 to more 3-year plans. But I think the main point here is that we plan beyond a year. And if any of you can think about your strategic plan and just sort of flip the pages in your mind, I hope that before you come to the end of it, you see the multi-year budget. Because a strategic plan without a budget is probably just a set of good ideas. So we want that effort. And the plan, again, as soon as you're done, will change. So if you don't feel you're in a position to predict the next 5 years, maybe 3, maybe 2, but the key is to think beyond this 1 year with or without the strategic plan.
And I like the idea of the Course Correction Act. That's a good idea. Michelle, what is the one tool, tactic, strategy everybody must adopt?
Actually, it connects to what Hilda was saying. I don't think we abandon strategic planning. I think that we have to be optimists. We have to be proactive. That's how we really make a difference in the work. That's why we came to this field in the first place. But strategic planning alone, I think, is the danger. Strategic planning, and picking up on, I know where Hilda's heart is needs to be coupled with scenario planning. You always have to have that parallel process where you're recognizing the uncertainty of the environment and how little you really can control, especially with government as your business partner. And so what that means to me is always thinking about what your core is. It's sort of like, the climbers on Everest, always have to prepare for hypothermia, and fortunately, the human body knows how to do that very well. Is that when things get bad, the human body knows to save the brain, and all resources will be pulled away from other functions to maintain what's absolutely essential. And I think that we need to have a really firm understanding about what that means for our organization and our mission. What's the brain? And what needs to be preserved at all cost, and be prepared to shift. And those are really hard conversations to have, but believe me, they're much harder to have when you have them too late.
Right.
Jessica, anything to add?
Just a riff on that, we've done a lot of work in risk management.
Right.
And we believe very strongly that coming out of the gate, you should have a fairly strong risk management tolerance statement built into your practice. Just to say, what do we think we could do, and it's a riff on scenario planning and strategic planning, if these situations, which are 90%, 80%, put some probability next to it, going to happen. This way, it all comes back to timing, right? This way, if the rubber meets the road and you're scrambling, you at least have a sense of what to do, and you won't have to work against the tide of your board by informing them and trying to get them on board because you've had these conversations. The other thing I would add is that there's a real lack of comparative analysis in this sector. When we put out our risk management report, we looked at 14,000 nonprofits in New York City and crunched the 990 data for them for 5 years and produced what were in effect league tables. Tables showing what the average grassroots nonprofit with a budget of under $1 million was doing, and how they manage their cash flow and cut them a bunch of different ways using very basic financial metrics. This should become part of the process. Understanding where you are relative to your peers is an important thing in this market, especially if you're thinking about what are we good at, what's our core, and what might we want to give away and divest.
Okay. I want you to, because I think with the Sea Change report that you released a couple of years ago with Oliver Wyman on risk management for nonprofits, it's a very exciting title. But I think a lot of people, when they think risk management, they think insurance, right? So I want you to be really clear about your definition of risk management,
Sure.
Because and I think the report was successful that over the last 2 years, definitely people are talking about this. Certainly I hear it within our grantee portfolio, and I hear funders talking about it, but I'm not sure we're all working with the same definition.
Gotcha.
So what did you mean when you put that out there into the nonprofit stratosphere?
Thank you for clarifying and calling me out for using jargon. We try to be jargon-free at
That's
Sea
right.
Change, so if it happens, please raise your hand and I'll try to course correct. Thank you, Hilda. So, risk management. Our report was born out of the FEG's bankruptcy because seemingly overnight they woke up and they were in a $19 million deficit through which they could not climb themselves out of. And we got a number of phone calls in the middle of the night in the very small hours from board members who were like, we were engaged. We were reading the board reports, which perhaps were not that good, but we thought we were on top of things. Jim is shaking his head. They were not very good. And we thought that we could weather the storm. And it was what I like to call the Lehman Brothers for the nonprofit sector. It was too big to fail, but it did. And so when we say risk management, we mean it in the most basic financial, like put your glasses up, put your pencils down, financially grounded definition. It is, where do your revenues, your income, your grants stack up against what your expenses are? And if you are looking at multi-year grants, multi-year funding, large federal contracts, and you can perceive that they are shifting, how will you be prepared for those large financial shifts? There's obviously conversations to be had about succession, about the broader federal government, but at the most basic level, when we talk about risk management, we mean purely from a financial lens. I'm sure, Hilda, you've got lots of thoughts on that.
I think risk management and risk tolerance, as you said, we will never be able to eliminate risk. That's just a part of doing business. So it's about mitigating it and understanding it, and financial is definitely one. I think certainly reputational is another. And human capital policies, big area of risk. So understanding how you do your business and how you mitigate that risk, I think, is the shift that has become really relevant after the FEG situation.
Okay. I have a few more questions to ask the panel. If you have questions and would like to submit them via the index cards, you'd start thinking about that now. I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question around their particular expertise right now, and I'm going to start with Michelle. Before I ask Michelle about advocacy, I want to know, in the last 3 months, how many of you have been in touch with either a federal legislator or city council person or the mayor's office? Show of hands. Okay. So, Michelle, nonprofits really seem to struggle with advocacy, and yet I think you know and I know that and believe that advocacy is really essential to nonprofits and their missions. And, and I say this with our friends from the Attorney General's office here in the audience, how do we, where the rules are very clear, but the boundaries are bright, but there's a lot of room within the boundaries in order to do lobbying and advocacy. What do we have to do to get nonprofit leaders more comfortable with advocacy and integrate it into, and this is the important part of the question, their day-to-day work? Because I think they see it as it needs to be a need to do, and it seems like it's a nice to do these days, still, even with this environment.
I know this is my favorite topic.
I know it is.
So I'm going to try to contain myself. As a person who started in this field in advocacy and government relations and spent the first 16 years of my work on the steps of City Hall and in Albany and DC, advocating for the nonprofit world, I definitely have a very strong position on this. I think the number one thing that we need to do, it's not just about how do we get organizations comfortable with advocacy. I think we actually have to write advocacy into the job descriptions of nonprofit leaders, that it is an essential skill that the leader of a nonprofit organization absolutely must have and must be prepared to use. I also could not sit here at Baruch without mentioning the need for our public service schools to teach advocacy as part of nonprofit management. It is, I hope that it's different than when I got I did not get my degree from Baruch, so Baruch, you're off the hook on this, but I will say that I entered my master's program after almost a decade in the field, and I was dismayed to see that there was absolutely no mention of advocacy at all. There was not even one single course on advocacy, and it was never mentioned in my entire time at the school that I attended. And I will say that I was being the advocate. I was very vocal about that, and I did manage to get a 2-credit elective course on advocacy. I don't know where it stands now. I should actually circle back and check. So that my advice is, number one, we have to teach it. We as leaders need to learn it. Advocacy is not just something that like anyone can do. It's a professional skill set, and we have to be prepared to use it. And the last thing I'll say on that is that, again, Good Shepherd Services is, I think, really bold in having advocacy as part of our mission statement. And I would encourage other organizations to really think about where advocacy fits in terms of your mission statement. Because if you're about social justice and equity, you need to be about advocacy. And again, going back to what I said earlier, government is our business partner. And we cannot be the silent partner. And too often, I think that we're willing to take that role and just deal with whatever comes our way, whatever government decides to do. But we can have a voice in that. And I have seen year after year after year how significant change has occurred because of the voice of nonprofit leaders. And if we actually, I'm going to be honest, many nonprofit leaders are free riders, that they benefit from the outcome of advocacy that is being led by a relatively small number of the leaders in this field. And when I see what's even done by that small group of leaders, and I have to call out my boss, Sister Paulette LaMonaco, who is always at the forefront and always willing to put her name at the top of the list when advocacy is on the line. When I think about what it would really be if we took advocacy seriously as part of our job as nonprofit leaders, what we could really do.
Great, thank you. And I second not only just Sister Paulette's leadership, but your leadership, Michelle. It's been essential to what's been happening. And I also agree that more need to join you on the forefront. I am encouraged by some recent developments. I know that Eastside House Settlement up in the Bronx has decided to put a full-time person devoted to government relations. That's a significant step. And I was pleased to see that Lenox Hill House, David French is here this morning, is going to build a team around social policy and advocacy. So I think that's encouraging that some of your colleagues are starting to see that this is a muscle they need to really start to strengthen.
Doug, please, I have one more thing I have to say. The philanthropy leaders in the room also need to fund it.
Yes.
And you can learn a lot from Doug, who I would say is at the forefront of that.
Duly noted. We'll come back to the funders in a second. All right. Hilda, and we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and get us to finish our part and then get to some of these questions because there's a lot of them, and that's great. So, Hilda, I want to go back to this, good to great nonprofits are always mindful of their finances. But what are boards and staff going to do now? I mean, you talked about being nimble, talking about building that muscle. So, what's the extra muscle around the financial question? Is it extra due diligence? I mean, what's financial resiliency, I guess, from your perspective?
So I'm happy that you're asking the question about resiliency and not words like transparency and accountability and the more traditional words that we've seen in recent years. So we think about resilience in striking the balance between being focused on the future and at the same time responding to the needs of today. So nonprofits' ability to do that is really where they're going to be able to be that sustainable business model. We think that happens in a couple of ways. Nonprofits need to have a value system that values team decision-making, that values continuous improvement, and that values focus on the mission in terms of investing those resources. We think resiliency means having practices that involve planning, that involve performance management, standards of quality, and lastly, those practices and those values are going to yield certain resources, and the resources are really reliable, unrestricted revenue, which we appreciate from Doug, effective leadership, and capital for change. I think something I want you to walk away with today is how can I shift my thinking from fundraising for activities to raising capital for my strategy. And if we can make that shift, we will be focusing, I think, on the right long-term goals.
Great, excellent, thank you. So Jessica, I get the sense that some nonprofits are beginning to realize that business as usual is not going to cut it, right?
Are you sure you want to ask me this, or you want to ask Michelle?
No, well, you know, she may jump in. So they're going to have to think and operate differently, and you know, and seek out collaboration, alliances, etc., and possibly merging or acquiring. So, what guidance do you have for organizations as they ponder future course and look at these different kinds of equations?
Sure.
Which is what you guys help, what Sea Change helps people try to do, right?
Every day.
Every day.
Every day.
Every day.
So listen, embarking on taking a step back, there used to be a taint and a stigma to the word nonprofit merger, right? And so I don't like to use merger, I like to use collaboration, because we really support everything on that spectrum. So a merger, a programmatic partnership, an administrative partnership, a divestment of one program, you know, to take over a piece of the other. Anything where two or more organizations are fundamentally changing the ways in which they do business by working together, we're game to talk to you about. And as you approach these conversations, I would say you really want to go into a dark room, perhaps with your board chair, and on a, yeah, seriously, and on a whiteboard, right? Assets. Okay, here's what we're good at. Next column, challenges or things that we're trying to solve for. Succession, government funding, perhaps emerging leaders. Where you want, so third column is where you want to be in 2 to 3 years. Fourth column is who you work with. And then the fifth column, which you should not ignore, what are your sacred cows? Is it your brand? Is it the way in which you do business? Is it your special approach to serving youth coming out of foster care? Whatever it is that you're unwilling to compromise on, and just look at those columns. And then, once you do that, start thinking about organizations that you might already be working with that can help solve and check some of those boxes. And then I would recommend going on dates. Go to lunch if you're not a drinker, go to dinner if you are a drinker, but these things are negotiated and discussed over many cups of coffee and many bottles of wine. And that's just how they work. And I would suggest if you're thinking about having these conversations, please call me. Because we make grants to support organizations that are in the early stages of these discussions, in addition to supporting organizations that are planning them, with the great help of the Clark Foundation and a number of other funders, including the New York Community Trust, which is here today. And so we're here to help smooth those waters, to help grease the wheels so that you can have safe, confidential, and informed discussions early so that you're not scrambling at the end.
All right. And in fact, I'm going to ask you one other, as a kind of a follow-up, Jessica, because there was a good question, which actually came to Michelle as well, given her senior fellow status now at Senior Change. But the question is, how can waiting too long, and that is in quotes, to pursue a merger be defined from the perspective of the acquirer? Mm-hmm. So what is there a waiting too long for this?
Oh, absolutely. So I hate talking in terms of acquisition, but if you're a smaller nonprofit who is in discussions with a larger nonprofit, you are feeling financial stress and the minutes tick by in your negotiations in a much deeper and more painful way, very likely, than your larger partner. So a day for them probably feels like a month for you. And oftentimes, we talk to organizations who have said, we're now scrambling because all of these things, in addition to the financial resources, take much more staff and board time than you would imagine. And so most organizations that we speak with, even if they've come to us quite early, say, we wish we had started these discussions 1 or 2 board meetings earlier than we had. So just, again, call me, and I will help you go on dates.
I'll only add to that is that we as a field need to do whatever we can to remove the stigma that nonprofit leaders can feel about thinking about a merger. And so that stigma creates fear that prevents strategic action. Leaders who are in a position of really thinking that the next best step for their organization and the next best way to promote their mission is through a partnership, a collaboration with another organization, should be thinking about that as an equal partnership. What's the value add that you want to bring to the table? It's sort of like Shark Tank. You know, you want to say, this is the value add, not like rescue me from drowning.
Interesting. All right. Here's a question. One final question, then we're going to jump to some of your questions. So I would have my funder membership card taken away if I didn't ask about the role of measurement. And it's interesting to me that we haven't really heard it come up from the three of you yet so far. So what is the role of measurement in this environment? How important is it? Would you like funders to kind of let up a little bit about this question? Or does it become even more important because you have to know and you should know how to keep score, right? So what's the role of measurement and evaluation in this uncertain environment? And is it, in a sense, could it be a tool for good rather than one that feels more like a compliance issue?
I'll start.
Yes.
I'll say that I actually would promote more measurement, but different measurement. I think that we're very comfortable with the idea of measuring a specific program model. And there's definitely a value for that, to that. However, I think the kind of measurement that we really want to be encouraging in the field is measuring the health of an organization, measuring what, for many of us at Good Shepherd Services, we're multi-service organizations, there's been a lot of desire from our funders to measure a specific program that we have. But that doesn't necessarily tell the funder a lot about the overall impact of the organization, because even the participants in a single program benefit from the larger entity. But more importantly, it's the emphasis on measurement that comes from funders that often can provide the impetus for an organization to really implement those strategies, especially if resources come with them. Good Shepherd Services was really fortunate to be a long-term grantee of the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, which allowed us to really think strategically about becoming a data-driven organization. And so I think at whatever scale, small, medium, or large, funders can be in partnership with organizations to really think about what measurement should mean for that specific organization.
And I'd like to jump in.
Yes.
Because I feel very strongly about this, because I like to count things and divide. I think you should measure responsibly. I think if you're going to...
So what does that mean?
So that, exactly.
Okay.
Measuring responsibly means that if you're going to ask an organization to invest in the resources to evaluate, quite critically, their impact, and you're collecting this information systematically for a number of organizations that are in a peer group, feed it back.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them, how are you doing? Here are some innovative models that I've seen based on what I've measured. And let's have a discussion about how we can improve the field and deepen the impact, because that's how we're going to change the advocacy discussion, right? None of this, you can't measure in a vacuum. To count just for the sake of counting feels sort of silly. And so how can we just get that information back into the market in a positive way?
Right, good. Anything you want to add to that, Hilda?
I think, so with measurement, we do have a lot of data available through technology and other means. What I would say is prioritize measurement. So there's a term that we love to work with called key performance indicators, KPIs. And we think you should have no more than 5 or 6 key indicators for board leadership, for focus. So let's not over-measure. At the same time, if we want to shift from fundraising for activities to capital for the enterprise and the enterprise's health, then we actually have to be able to talk about our outcomes in a more holistic way. And so measuring those as opposed to units is also another measure.
Great, good. All right,
And we think one of the sexiest terms these days is the concept of dashboard. So I'll just leave you with that.
Dashboards are indeed sexy.
Very sexy.
Very sexy. Very sexy. No, and I appreciate this round of comments on this particular topic, because the thing is that from my perspective, we still see a little too much of process as the product in the sector, and that's not going to get us very far at all. So, all right, let's move to some questions, and there's a lot of them, and if you have more, we'd be happy to collect those as well. Michelle, somebody asked, can you provide an example of effective advocacy? And then a part 2 is, what's the board's role in advocacy?
I'll start with part 2. The board's role in advocacy, I think, is to support it and to expect it. I know that that's true of our board, and so we have conversations about our advocacy at board meetings. What are the challenges that we're experiencing in our partnership with government, and what are we doing about it? So that should become a normal part of your leadership conversation, sort of looping back to what I said earlier. There are so many examples of really amazing, effective advocacy. The first one that pops into my mind is just the work that we did as part of a partnership with a number of other organizations, providers, as well as advocacy organizations called the Campaign for Children, that really led the effort to both maintain the after school and early childhood systems, but in particular, as part of that, a group of us who were providers sat through many sessions with City Hall to talk about what the rate should be for the per participant cost for after-school programs. And this is I might get in trouble for this, but this is something that I also feel really strongly about. That when it comes to these kinds of conversations, those are conversations that I believe most importantly need to be had and are most effectively done when it's the provider speaking directly to government and not through our coalitions. We have many wonderful coalitions that we're part of. Some are in this room right now, and if you're not part of them, I urge you to join. But there's some advocacy work that really needs to be done directly by providers, and being able to really lay out our actual budgets and our actual costs for providing high-quality services and using that information to drive a financial model and rate per participant was some of the most effective advocacy that I've been involved in.
Good, and that's a great comment and answer, Michelle. I think the other thing, too, just very tactically, there's been a pretty big turnover in City Council. If you've not been to see your City Council person and tell them directly what you're doing in their council district in terms of services and, outputs, outcomes, et cetera, I mean, just doing that and making sure that that happens is important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually heading there right after this panel, so I'm going to be dashing.
There you go.
But really, seriously, if anyone wants to do it, and I know how scary it can be when you first get started, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to go with you. I'm happy to make a connection or sort of talk you through the process. It's not as scary in practice as it may seem.
Okay. This question is one that has been bouncing around for it's an evergreen question, but it takes on, I think, some urgency in the current climate, and I'll address it to Hilda, who has a national perspective, and Jessica, you obviously have with the work that Sea Change has been doing. The question is, given the potential impact of reduction in funding to the sector, do you foresee more consolidation in the sector? What are the pros and cons? This is that, and tacking onto this question is that, here, Mr. Sheehan's pointing out via Karen's excellent research, there's 11,000 nonprofits just in Brooklyn, right? So this is an ancient question of, do we have too many nonprofits? Do we need to consolidate? What are your thoughts on that?
Why don't you start?
I'm not allowed to have an opinion as to whether or not there are too many nonprofits. It's just, that's above my pay grade, and, just is what it is. Whether or not I think the funding is going to drive more consolidations, the conversations I'm having would lead me to say yes. And yes, for more reasons than just funding. So across all of the funds that we manage 3 funds that support nonprofit, what I'm going to call mergers. Succession is the #1 issue driving these consolidations because the baby boomers are starting to retire en masse. So if you look and you're trying to solve for succession and you've also got some funding things that you might want to sort out, there's a good reason to get on the phone with folks that you very well might want to marry. What I will say is that these don't often start off as, we just need to merge. There is a spectrum of activity. There are steps that people take. So it very often starts with a joint program, with trust built at that level. There's often connectivity across board members. There's connectivity across the leadership levels. And so, yes is the short answer, that the financial situation is driving a bunch of these conversations, but it's not the single reason why they're happening.
Doug, if I could just say that I don't think that this is really a quantity question. I think it's really an efficiency question. And just, speaking to the report that Sea Change had released, I mean, the numbers were very clear. We have, separate from the question of whether we have too many nonprofits, we have too many nonprofits operating on the brink of insolvency.
Right.
So we are clearly not operating at any point even remotely connected to efficiency. And so that's a problem in the sector. There are many different ways to solve that problem, not only reducing the number of nonprofits, but for one thing, we certainly have to act together to reduce the number of nonprofits that are on the brink of insolvency.
Right. Hilda?
And I'm amazed at the number of communities that I walk into where it takes a couple of conversations and then it comes up, the M word, the collaboration. And it's often funders who see the need, want to support it, and are concerned that the funder's probably not the best person to bring it up. And so I think it's sort of
Why?
a cycle. I think funders they want to see it happen, but when the fear is that if the idea comes from the funder, it must be that they want to reduce the funding. It must be that they don't see the uniqueness of each of us. And so I would encourage us to be the one to bring it up. If we think, I have a history of being on a board where we strategically moved an organization into another organization, and some of our fellow board members are in the room, and I think we thought we would say it was the best thing to do at the time. And so just the cost of doing business, the shared back office opportunities, the shared programming, the referral sources that can exist if there's more strategic conversation. It really is, it's a type of fundraising in some ways. If it costs you less to do what you do, you've actually just raised money. So think of it as a fundraising strategy.
I would also add on to that, which maybe your turn to plug general operating support.
Sure.
That this activity is risky. So having conversations with organizations about what you might be able to do together, and going to an important funder and saying, we are thinking about doing something, but we're not quite sure what that could be, and we may come away not actually doing anything, is a fraught conversation to have.
Right.
And so building risk tolerance in the community, building the capacity for organizations to have these conversations is an important piece of it. And so
Right.
Doug, as a funder,
Yes.
what are you going to do to support this activity?
Nothing. No. No. It's a great question. And first of all, it's interesting what you said, Hilda, about funders, and that perhaps the concern or fear is that we'll want to fund less. That's the, I would just, and I've talked with several of my colleagues about this question. First of all, funders fly at a different altitude. We have a different perspective on things, good or bad. And but I think we also kind of see, maybe a larger landscape. And we are, and it's not you're right. I think it is this efficiency question, right? And then when I do look at what's on the horizon, it does concern me. Not everybody's going to be there in the aftermath of the storm. And so, the question is, do you get ahead of it, especially if you're a smaller nonprofit? I think if you're a community-based nonprofit, 6 figures, maybe low 7 figures, how do you think about this? And maybe what you do, and maybe it's more like a hub and spoke. Maybe and I think we have to be honest. 80% of the human services in this city are delivered by 20% of the organizations. Right, the larger institutions like Good Shepherd, the settlement houses, et cetera, are the ones that are really carrying the weight. For the smaller organizations who are doing good work, there's no question that good work is going on. Do you start to link yourself, however you define the word link, with some of these larger institutions? And I think, what probably needs to happen is conversations about how are we going to support services at a neighborhood level in a thoughtful, efficient, effective way, and make sure that we reach all the clients that we need to reach, and then determine what resources we can do to do that effectively. And I'd say that what funders are doing is, you got to provide general operating support. That is absolutely essential. We obviously believe very strongly in that. B, you've got to fund the management training / capacity building to do this work. C, you've got to fund advocacy, which goes back to general operating support. That's the best way to support advocacy. Those are the 3 things that I think funders have to do in this environment.
Amen.
So,
I just wanted to say that there's this idea that merging immediately will have reduction of costs especially with what I just said. And it's a little bit of it costs more before it costs less. And I think that's where the funding from funders who think this is a strategic option would be well served.
Okay. Claire, we have about 8 minutes from 5 minutes. All right. Let me ask, there's a couple of questions about how do we get ourselves out of it, and is earned revenue the savior? All right. One question is, in a time of increasing social enterprise and social businesses as a force, how do we make the case for completely non-market driven services, and a fear that more philanthropic money is going to social enterprise via mission-related investing, program-related investments, et cetera, at the same time as shrinking public money? So what do nonprofits do? So what is the role of earned income? And by the way, if I put my hat on as a board member of the National Council of Nonprofits, if you look at every dollar that goes into the sector writ large, half of it is already an earned revenue. 50 cents of that dollar is earned revenue. So it's not like that's not here. But what is the role of earned revenue in this situation? Hilda?
I think earned revenue is an option, but not for everyone. And there is this idea that it's the sort of silver lining solution to all nonprofits. That's not the case. It may be for some. Some of us, through years, may have developed a secret sauce, something we do really well, that government has paid for, or maybe philanthropy has, but it's such deep and impactful secret sauce that someone might be willing to pay for it. But you need to test that theory before you jump into building that business. So the business plan analysis, do we really have something that is marketable, that people would pay what it costs, or with a profit built in? Those are the types of questions to ask first. And while it may be a great answer for some, it's not for others, and then you'd be putting your mission work at risk.
Right. I would add that oftentimes earned income is really just defrayed philanthropy, right? So you're earning income instead of going out and pounding the pavement. And so, it's really a balance, right? There's no amount of coffee that you're going to sell that's going to earn enough revenue and unrestricted dollars to allow you to innovate in the way that a very large grant from an organization that believes in your mission is going to be. And so instead of talking abstractly about the silver bullet of earned income, let's talk more concretely about where you are taking on contracts that are giving you some cushion that you are then using to smooth the way for some activity where perhaps you're not making ends meet. And then talking about how to increase the activity under those contracts that do pay, and growing your business that way.
I'm going to answer this somewhat unconventionally. I did learn from many politicians over the course of my career how to answer the question you want to be asked instead of the one that you were asked. And that is, absolutely. And that is for nonprofit organizations to really think seriously about building an endowment. I know that that is like the E word, but in terms of self-generated revenue, making sure that you have an endowment that is robust enough and complementary to the scale of your overall operations and the amount of private funding that you require, to really seek to become perhaps your own biggest funder. That's something that Good Shepherd Services is thinking seriously about now. It's part of our risk management strategy to deal with the uncertainty in the government environment. And I think that it's something that all leaders in the public sector, from wherever you may sit, whether you're a nonprofit leader or a funder who might receive a request, to really think seriously about this strategy.
Hilda, one final comment
I
there.
just need to say that, Michelle, given the size of an organization, I think endowment is a great question. The question is, do you have the capacity to raise enough funds to create an endowment with enough of a corpus to generate enough revenue to support your operations? That was long-winded, but that's what an endowment is about. So if you feel you could use $10,000 a year to support your operations, figure out what that is at 0.25%. What would be the number you would need? And then if you have the capacity, by all means, go for it. But if you don't, you may want to think about reserves and some other strategic funds.
Good. I have one final question, and then I want you to all to wrap up. What's one takeaway you want folks to walk away with from this panel? So, but on this social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, impact investing, et cetera. First of all, I think if you look at the numbers, there's not been a flood of money coming from the foundation world. There is some money being paid attention to this issue, but not to the extent that I think people think it is if you look at the actual numbers. The social impact bond, impact investing folks have a lot of cheerleaders. And so that's why you hear a lot of noise about it. And Ronna Brown's in the audience, and she knows I love to talk about social impact bonds. I do not like social impact bonds, and I won't talk any more about it, I promise, Ronna. But here's the thing. We are having, and this is the time right now, to have a discussion about what government should actually pay for and not market forces. And that's the debate we're in right now. Is market forces going to play more and more of a role in society? And this is cyclical. We had this conversation during the Reagan years, but it's come back full force and then some, all right? And so really, as it relates to what do we believe and how do we believe the social safety net should be sustained in the city, if it is to be mostly a government response, outsourced through nonprofits, then you have to fight for that and not be distracted by things like market forces and things like social impact bonds. So that's just something to think about. Final question, and this is an interesting one, and I'm sorry I didn't get to some of the other questions. They were all very good. Do you have any suggestions, panel, on how you might allocate time to risk assessment or risk mitigation? Would you target a percentage? So how much time should you be devoting to this notion of trying to manage the disruption, right? What should staff be doing? What should the board be doing? And then a final takeaway from each of you. So why don't you answer that question and then a takeaway, and then we'll wrap up. Michelle.
Percentage of time. I think that that in an ideal world, a percentage of staff of every staff meeting should be devoted to the question of risk management in some way. At the very least, to ask like, what's going wrong? What are we worried about right now? What can we do about it? That should just be, those kinds of questions should be embedded in our leadership conversations. My biggest takeaway, personally, and what I hope everyone else will take away as well, is this efficiency question. And maybe to ask ourselves as a sector, how do we need to redefine the skill set of nonprofit leaders to really be able to move the field and the sector in a direction of greater efficiency?
Great. Hilda, percentage of time, a takeaway.
I don't know that I can answer percentage of time. I would say framework for doing the work differently. So having staff and board think together about areas of risk, identifying them. There's the pre-mortem concept instead of the post-mortem. What can go wrong, and think about it, as you said, Michelle. So I would say think about how you do your business rather than trying to tack on a percentage. As far as the takeaway, I'm just going to repeat myself. Building the planning muscle to be able to course correct and recalibrate when you need to.
I'm not going to opine on percentage of time, but what I will say is what we do at Sea Change, excuse me, is we give this job of risk management to the person who is the most persnickety person on the team, which unfortunately is me, so I'm always thinking about it. But I also force our team to think about it when I see things come up. And so who knows what percentage of my time that it is, but it does seem a little bit consuming. In terms of the takeaway, I hope that you come away from here thinking about what actions you might want to take, conversations you might want to have, what activities you might want to follow up with, and hopefully making new connections, because I think this is a moment where thinking, digesting, and sitting around with a bunch of good ideas but not doing something isn't going to be enough. So please, I'm going to come out of here hoping to connect with a bunch of you, but let's take some activity and some real action following this meeting.
Great. Can we have a round of applause for the panel? Let me just say, it's interesting. I just finished my nonprofit crash course on the nonprofit sector at Columbia Business School, and Jessica's colleague, John McIntosh, spoke to the class and talked about and he's Canadian, if you didn't know that, and he says, you know, I just marvel at the American nonprofit sector. It is truly a miracle. Most countries would absolutely want this in their country, and we are so lucky in this country to have it. And it's important to fight for it. And so I would ask that you need to shift into happy warrior mode, probably in the next couple of years, to defend it and to defend it for the right reasons, all of which you do on a day-to-day basis. So I thank you for that commitment. Work on that muscle, and we'll see you around. Thank you very much. Claire?
Thank you very much. A true warrior, Doug Bauer, and the panel, thank you. A couple of quick things. This part's going to be really hard, I'm afraid. You're going to need to be back here in 10 minutes. We have a reception outside, the refreshments rather. If you do have to leave, and I hope you don't, but please do drop your evaluation out at the front desk. But I do want to thank this panel. It was a great conversation, a needed conversation, so thank you. So, refresh, back in 10 minutes. Thank you.